This is Bob Ferguson and Doc Hall. We are live on Facebook. This is the next episode of Life with Bob. We're in on most Monday nights at 8 p.m. I invite people on, sometimes to my little show, who I think really have something to say. And tonight is an extraordinary example of that. Doc Hall, thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Bob. So, how do you want to start this?
Okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. You were kind enough to send me your short bio, and so I get it all in. I'm just going to read it. How about that? That work?
Okay.
Good. Okay, so Doc Hall is Professor Emeritus of Operations Management, Kelley School of Business, Indiana University. He is an Army veteran, and early in his civilian career as a chemical engineer, he worked for Eli Lilly and Union Carbide. In 1985, he helped found the Association for Manufacturing Excellence. For 22 years, he was editor-in-chief of its publication, Target. In 2002, he was honored as the first recipient of the Association of Manufacturing Excellence Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2006, he received the Gold Medal for Lifetime Achievement from the Society of Manufacturing Engineers. Doc, as he is known in industry, was one of the first examiners for the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. He was a judge for the PACE Award for Innovation Among Auto Industry Suppliers. He helped design Industry Week's America's 10 Best Plants Award, for which he was an examiner for many years. And he helped design the Association for Manufacturing Excellence Best Company Awards. In the 1970s, Doc began to compare American and Japanese manufacturing, investigating what today we call lean operations. In 1982, he wrote Zero Inventories, one of the first books detailing what he had learned. But lean operations depends on people-centered leadership and organizational culture. So we moved on to study that. Along the way, Doc noticed that blind concentration on operational productivity neglected the growing problems of environmental sustainability. In 1992, he wrote The Soul of the Enterprise, foreshadowing his latest book, Compression, which projects that our challenges of the 21st century are much more comprehensive than the challenges of the 20th century. We are in a squeeze beyond the ability of technical and operational improvements to resolve. We must fundamentally rethink what we do and why. Doc was on the board of Indiana Members Credit Union, $2 billion assets for 30 years, most of that time as chairman of its investment committee. Doc is now chairman of the Compression Institute, an organization developing principles by which to live better while using far fewer natural resources. Our biggest challenges are not technical. Our biggest challenge is us, how we think. And in 2006, Doc married his high school sweetheart, Sandra Stiles Brown, and moved to Hondo, Texas. Well, Doc, you've done a thing or two in your life.
Yeah, I went around the block a couple of times.
He told me, he said, no, that's my very, 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 very short bio. He said, the academic one is about 3 inches thick. So this is fantastic. So Doc, you and I got to know each other a couple of years ago, and we have been conversing, being involved in national conference calls, discussing and thinking about weighty matters. But when I first met you and I first looked at the idea of compression, I thought it was absolutely brilliant, because we have been in a paradigm of expansion. If you want more, you extract more. If you want more, you grow more. You fish more. Everything is based on expanding through expansion of extraction. And of course, as you will point out, we have a finite world. So there's a little bit of a problem with that as time goes on. And as you pointed out in the introduction, basically those problems now in the 21st century are beyond our technical ability to substitute and fix and all that. So we need a complete redo in our thinking. So with that's what I've understood in brief from our many interactions. And of course, there's remarkable ramifications of that. And I think much, much more in the area of opportunity and problems. Yes, we have big problems, but we have huge opportunities inherent in that. So over to you.
Can you see that now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, first the title, Psychology at the End of the World. Sounds pretty dramatic, but the emphasis is on the term psychology. And you can see the website and my address there, and welcome any communication from anybody that wants to. It's not like this is a popular topic that just grabs people and they gotta know a whole lot more about it. So we just start out with existential crises. There are a bunch. You usually hear about these sort of one at a time. I'm not going to even try to read through all these. There are too many of them. This is the first of 3 slides. Bob, I think one that really grabs you is topsoil depletion and erosion.
Well, yeah, when you think of what happens with cultures where the cities are overtaken by the jungle, and there might have been, many, many square miles of city, and there isn't anymore. And at some point, that whole thing stopped. And as I read it, in books like Guns, Germs, and Steel, it's basically when we overrun the carrying capacity of our ecosystem. And topsoil depletion, just in the Midwest here, where you're from, Iowa soil started out with an average of 14 feet of topsoil, and we now have 5. And all that 14 feet of topsoil was created since the glaciers left 12,000 years ago. So if you divide 14 feet by 12,000, you can get a sense of how long it takes to build that topsoil up. So when we run out of topsoil, we run out of the capacity to grow food in the bread basket of the U.S. So yeah, that's a pretty good existential crisis among many.
Yeah, it's one of those that slowly creeps up on you. You don't realize it's happening until, oh my gosh. And by the way, the first responders where this becomes acute disruption of the soil are mushrooms. So I'm trying to get a lady who's investigated this. How would human history read if it was written by mushrooms?
It'd be a lot of chapters on end games, right?
Yeah. So topsoil depletion, biodiversity loss. I can see that right where I am. That over about a 10-year period, there just aren't as many insects and birds and whatever coming around as there used to be. And I live at the edge of a town.
Yep.
As Yogi Berra used to say, it's amazing what you can see just by just looking. And one that certainly affects Iowa is nitrate runoff.
Yep.
I was amazed to find that there are 400 dead zones mostly off the various rivers around the world. The one at the mouth of the Mississippi is one of the bigger ones, but there's a bunch of them. It is not just one problem.
Right.
One that's gotten a lot of attention recently is plastic microparticles. And I was in the plastics industry once. We had no idea that this consequence could happen. That was 60 years ago almost now. Another sneaky one is endocrine disruptors. You go through the list, that's usually one that people have never heard of. If they see something they never heard of, that's sneaky because atrazine is pretty well known now to be an endocrine disruptor in frogs. So it affects animals, not just humans. And this stuff is everywhere. I've seen a list of about 800 known and suspected endocrine disruptors. And what does it do? Well, the last I checked on it, endocrinologists, about half of their patients had a diabetes problem, suspected to be connected somehow with their endocrine systems that weren't handling the sugar.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a rabbit hole we can crawl down if anybody wanted to, and I don't know very much about it. I'm not an endocrinologist, or I'm not an expert on any of this stuff really, because I've never studied it in great depth. Second one on that list, food security, lack of nutritious food. I know you're concerned with that. For 50, 60 years now, there's a pretty good nutrient density in food grown in the United States has decreased. There's not as many vitamins and minerals per ounce or pound as there used to be. How does that affect us? Then you get to just plain depression. I don't know about Iowa, but particularly in the farming communities and a good many others, people aren't particularly happy. They're depressed.
Right.
You know, if you're a farmer, fifth, sixth generation, and you're about to lose the place, that's pretty depressing. Some of them commit suicide. Some high rates of suicide, medical doctors, veterinarians, police, veterans, armed forces veterans. What's going on here? Why are we that way? Everything's supposed to be great, so why are so many people depressed? Whoops, go back on that. Population growth is one. I'll just leave that up. Population growth is one, and that's one that a lot of people emphasize. If we didn't have as many people, we wouldn't have all these problems. That's true, but it isn't just that we're here. It's all the stuff we use that we drag with us that is a major problem. So the last on the list is that great classic climate change. And the way the media has worked this, most of these issues get connected somehow with climate change, and climate change does make about all of them worse. However, if we weren't putting as much CO2 in the air and we didn't have that problem going on, good many of those other problems ultimately would be a real threat to us anyway. Or as one of my wonderful friends has expressed it to me, if we were able to generate an infinite amount of energy for our use from all that dark energy in the universe, we're foolish enough we could do ourselves in with it anyway, because we're just not very smart in what we do. In other words, maybe we don't know what's in our own best interest all the time. And you can see that now and then. If we did, we probably wouldn't become alcoholic and other things. So there's a problem here. Don't know necessarily what we need to do, but here's things we need to do about this. And most people have thought about it. Let's say, yeah, that's the list. We're already using way too much. We cannot continue to grow at the same rate. Almost the father of the peak oil theory was M. King Hubbard, and he had it nailed in the 1950s. You can't double the use of petroleum and double the amount of other resources we use about every 20 years and do that indefinitely, because every time you double, it's on a bigger base, and pretty soon you don't exactly run out. You just get to where it creates too much damage, and it takes too much energy to get what you're getting anymore. Or down here in Texas, the original spindle top, the oil gusher, bored down with a steam engine about 600-700 feet, and kaboom, the oil under pressure squirted up, and most everybody's seen the movie picture with people with oil on their face. No wonder they called it black gold. The return on that was about 100 to 1. Today with fracking, it's about 5-1.
Hmm.
And that's nature's way, or more like nature's way of looking at it. You can fool yourself by using cheap energy to get expensive energy. And so just need to rethink what we're doing in a good many ways. Most people actually doing something are trying to localize an economy. That is, not exactly go back to village life in medieval times, but much more of our living would be close to home, including getting your food, maybe not traveling as much. If you really want to reduce fuel use, well, just don't go as much or stay home. Well, this is not something that's pleasant to people. They don't like to, if you get used to going places, you don't want to stop going places. I don't. The R's, reuse, remanufacture, recycle. We could do much more there than we do. Big problem is we've not designed things to be reused, remanufactured, recycled. We became in too many ways a throwaway society. And so we say by the current system, it just isn't economical to do this. The fourth one, I like the term revitalize, as frequently regenerate, a few other terms. Revitalize nature. Nature, if you let it, will heal itself. It may not do what we think it would do. It won't ever come back to what it was, but it's always trying to grow. Any crack on the sidewalk, if it's there very long, something's trying to grow out of it. Something's trying to grow. And so we can pursue that one, but the main idea is to work with nature, not against it. Let it revitalize itself. The fifth one is pretty much mine. Can we figure out how to live as well, maybe even better, and use much less? And that gets you to the psychology of what does better mean to you? Is it, if better in your mind is having 6 houses and 27 cars, is that really living better? Or what is, in your mind, a good life? Oops. The shift in attitudes. Growth, you talk to almost anybody in business and what they want the business to do, grow. I never know quite what they mean by that. Often they mean an increase in top line, bottom line, revenue and profit. Sometimes it just means that the company needs to constantly regenerate itself. That is new thinking, keep up with it. That's qualitative growth, not quantitative. So we've never in the business world really seriously talked about what does growth mean? Why is it good or not? A lot of people want to cure all these problems with technology. Surely the next invention will make all these things go away. It probably won't. Or we try a lot of adventures in technical ones, see if we can do something just because we can do it, without regard to potential consequences if that's rolled out. We have to think a lot more about that. And seriously question the long-term consequences of anything that we would, certainly if we were going to roll it out on any major scale. Learn to care for nature. If you don't take care of it, it won't take care of you. And you can go down any rabbit hole here you want to, Bob. I call it creating new social understandings. The term is a new social contract. What are the implications? For example, I think you can see today that returns on investment are not what they used to be. I have a retirement fund. It's not earning very much. There's no place to put it where it is going to earn very much that isn't high risk. And that's true of almost everybody's retirement fund. And in general, they've got a problem with this. because you can't come up with a nice, safe investment index that gives you, your nice 5% per year return, and you pile it up enough, and you can just live on the coupon clippings, so to speak. If you can't do that anymore, and we have to change that system, that's a new social understanding between the generations. I haven't heard anybody talk about that very much, but it's probably what's coming. Incidentally, you're under the influence of the monetary system if your first question about any of these things is, how much is it going to cost? Well, all this costs a lot right now. Not a good question. What's the cost of not doing something different? If you can use that frame of reference, that takes us to, if I can find lost my mouse, Bob, get the last.
Let's see.
Here we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
You also use the arrows on your.
Yeah, well, I keep playing with the mouse and losing it, so.
There you go. That's okay.
So these are guidelines. I found it to be helpful to my thinking. Kind of keep the list in the back of the mind, and you look at any situation, and how would you look at it differently? Well, number one, there's many limits to economic growth. There isn't just population, there isn't just running out of stuff, or isn't just too many poisons, and et cetera. There's many limits. We went through that list.
Right.
Partial list. Summarize that. Earth's finite. You can only do so much with it and in it and on it. The second one, symbiotic thinking. That's been commonly called systems thinking. What's the effect on nature of what you are and what you do? Or most people now have heard of microbiomes. You're 90% something else. 90% of the cells that compose your body are not really you. They're other things. You're symbiotic with them. And so when we think of nature, we usually think of it as something other than us. Well, stop thinking of it that way. Nature is living in you, on you, and is symbiotic with you. That's a whole different point of view. So do we need to take care of nature? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, we can kind of kick that around a little bit. Isn't it extraordinary that even people who manifestly, if they think about it, did not make their mind, they didn't make their nose or fingernails or any other part of them. They're living in what I sometimes refer to as rental property.
Yeah.
And yet, because of a mistake of perception, because of what I consider a lack of full perception, we get the feeling, we can have the feeling that we're separate. And many of these considerations you're talking about, Doc, I would think are symptomatic of human beings having the psychology of being different from nature, when in point of fact, they're every bit as much a product of nature as you pointed out. Stuff in us, on us, around us. We're completely structured by nature. Who else would have done that? What other agency would have done that? But because of the way our mind can work, when we're not fully awake, then we can have the illusion of being separate. That's always something that I've thought about since I was 19 years old.
Yeah, it's you want to dig down into the philosophy, that's back to what's called Cartesian dualism, that we are somehow objective and we can objectively see other things. We're not a part of it.
Right.
Not really true. And increasingly, there is, even among the philosophers, there is a rejection of that, 300-year-old Cartesian dualism now.
Right.
It had a great effect. It led substantially to the science we have today, right. And it represents a problem within science today, because further insights say that you can't really do that, that we are a part of the systems we study, and it's very difficult to be totally objective about it because of that. And we throw those terms around. What does that mean? Anyway, let's go on here and we can come back.
We can go down any of these rabbit holes and spend the whole hour.
Yeah, you can. This covers just about everything. So pick your rabbit hole. That third one's organized for effective learning. Most companies and even most municipalities or governments are organized for efficiency, or we think they are. You spend much time with organizations talking about efficiency, and nope, they're really not, but they think they are.
Right.
Well, organized for effective learning, what are the consequences of what you are doing? Do what you're doing using fewer resources or paying less, or whatever the model you use, the money model or any other model. What does that tell you? It's concentrating on efficiency. We don't concentrate on whether what we're doing is good for us or the planet or nature or whatever else long term. The last one's quality over quantity, always. Quality there refers, in my thinking anyway, to quality of life cycles. It includes quality in the more or less commercial sense too. But quality over quantity, give an example using money. I was just talking with a lady today about school lunches and her problems with bureaucracy and trying to give the kids, nutritious food, and you can put it in front of them, but they don't have time. And what are they going to do? They're going to grab the quickest thing to eat and go, just like mom and dad do usually. And so the food waste there is enormous, but they don't get the best stuff. They get stuff that the school budget will allow them to get, which means it's not terribly tasty, which means the kids don't like it, which means you can't get out of the trap. Well, quality over quantity, if you could stem the food waste of the food that's sat out and they don't take it, or if they do take it, they don't like it and they scrape it off into the can when they go out of the room, you could probably get better food. And so that's just one example that's fairly practical about quality over quantity. And if you just take the food issues or food waste is enormous. Estimated worldwide from various causes that only 40-50% of all the food grown actually goes into a mouth. The rest of it may rot before it ever leaves the field. It may rot in storage. It's outdated in somebody's refrigerator, or you take too much and you scoop it off the plate. And so that's just one illustration of quality over quantity. Geez, I keep losing my mouse there, Bob. There we go.
Yeah.
So you act on the first point. That's pretty common, that we want to continue the life that we sort of know. Today, that'd be kind of known as a conservative point of view. I'm not sure that it is, but we don't want the consequences. We keep imagining that we can do what we've always done and somehow we'll save our environment on the side. Or I've heard it say, when we get enough money, we'll deal with these.
Mm-hmm.
Never have enough money. So we got to change our perspective. And this gets down pretty fundamental. How do we relate to the ecology around us? What are we really? Are we part of it or not? Is the world here is just something for us to use and consume, or is it something for us to take care of it? By the way, started thinking about this, and I remember I came from farm country in Indiana rather than Iowa, but I remember the prayers of farmers, and you could tell the difference kind of looking back on it. The ones that really took care of the land would start their thanks for every meal. O Lord, we thank thee for thy bounty. It's not something they did. It was something that nature somehow, some way let them have. They knew it.
Yep.
It may not have been explicit to them, but it was buried in the way they opened a prayer. And then relativity in physics, you got to realize that Earth is one tiny speck in the universe, and we're one little tiny speck in it, and we think we're so grandiose. And so many of our systems are based on us thinking that we are the center of something. Even the business system is, because transactions going in and out, that's money going in and out of some boundary. That's the center of something we call me, our household, a company. And so the whole system that we use in transaction and in business assumes, without us thinking very much about it, that we are the center of something. And if everybody that is the center of something keeps trying to maximize something, we're all going to be well off. What's wrong with that argument? That's pretty fundamental. The third part is you start thinking this way, and our explanations of causality become more complex. We tend to jump at solutions without really thinking them through. But if you deal with medicine or maybe even with farming, you know that there is rarely just one cause for anything. What you're doing is intervening in some system and hoping that you can prod it to move in a direction you'd like. You do that whether you're gardening, whether you're farming, whether you're a physician that's diagnosing a patient and suggesting change in diet or change in medicine or something. You're intervening in a system, and to use not a very great metaphor, it has a mind of its own. It is not something you can directly control, and magic will happen. So what questions we got, or where do you want to dive now, Bob?
Well, let's just keep, if you have more slides, we'll keep going. Otherwise, we can just pull off.
That's all the slides. So.
Okay, good. All right. So why don't we can stop share, and we can just kind of kick this stuff around and think about what does all this mean. So one of the things that I really enjoy about interacting with you, Doc, is that you don't have any pat answers. There's no central theory that if you do this, everything is going to be fine. In fact, it can be quite disorienting to think this way, because as you were talking, I was thinking, well, I try to do my best. I have a big house here in Iowa, but I've got a tenant downstairs with a roommate, and I got 2 people in the front. And so we're kind of amortizing our carbon footprint over more people. But I really want to drive to Dallas to visit my friend. And so often I want to fly to visit my grandkids or do business and that kind of thing. And I kind of want it to be warm when I get to my little tree house here. And I want food. I want food in the grocery store. So when I'm hungry, I go and get that food. Every one of us wants what we've got. And as you pointed out, we want to keep what we've got and somehow fix everything and save the environment on the side. And I think a simple analysis of that shows the fallacy of that. Just because if you look at all the trends, and climate change is just one consequence, but as you can say, pick your poison. You put 20 existential threats and you got tired of putting them down, so you quit. But you could have kept going and going and going. So I guess the question is, anyone watching this, so what do we do? What are some of the things that we can do as individuals and in towns and in groups and in areas and states and in the country? What are the kinds of things that we can do? And maybe more important than that, and we dealt with this extensively in our conversation, the second conversation I had with Admiral Len Herring, one of the most fabled Navy-based commanders in history, and I think he knows you, or I guess it was Russ Conser who said he knew you, but in any case, Len is a career military guy and kind of like you, done a lot of things at a very high level. And the point that he made is that we simply can't keep doing what we're doing. We have to rethink what it means to be happy. We have to rethink our orientation to nature and to other people. And it really, we had a pretty good discussion about kind of the mistake of feeling inside that the only growth I can get is growth of income or number of cars or, amount of assets. And I pointed out that, my mom had me, and I guess some of the other kids, memorize the Sermon on the Mount. And I recall that, and the Lord's Prayer is part of that, and in the Lord's Prayer it says, give us this day our daily bread. It doesn't say, give us this day our daily bread and bread for 10,000 years so we won't be paranoid about running out of bread. There's a certain kind of quality of moving through life in a sufficient way, but only a sufficient way, because the acquisition of things doesn't really make us happy. John Eichert, I don't know whether you...
Oh, yeah, no. John.
Yeah. So John makes the point, and I think it's very powerful, that not all the things of value can be denominated in dollars or yen or rubles or whatever. And he said, in fact, the things that mean the most to us, that are the most important to us, absolutely cannot be denominated in dollars. How do you denominate love in dollars, or acceptance, or community, or family, or aesthetic pleasure, or hearing music, or creating music? Those are not dollar-denominated things. And yet we have a society that tells us that in order to be happy, you have to have a certain amount of this stuff. And so everyone is scrabbling to get the stuff. So that's a juncture that we can take off from.
Yeah, well, oh, you mentioned somebody had sent in, well, this is what's the difference between this and Malthusian theory?
Malthusian, yes. My friend, when I invited him to this, he said, wait, if I can bring it back up, what is the difference between this and Malthusian theory?
Well, old Malthus had a point. You got to go back to Thomas Malthus, 1797, I think it was. It hadn't been that long before that you really did have famines. They were not abstract. And of course, Malthus has been, sneered at because he pronounced that right when the Industrial Revolution was taking off. And, we were able to occupy a lot more ground, produce a lot more. Expansion was just taking off at that point. But Malthus had a point. The last famine of note to Westerners was the Irish potato famine in 1845-46 after Malthus.
Mm-hmm.
And so his idea was that if people just kept procreating and the human population outran its food supply, people would starve. Well, not only is that possible, it did happen sometimes because people were separated and it would happen and nobody knew about it and the food wouldn't get there. And in fact, during the Irish potato famine, the Brits could have shipped in food, but they couldn't believe it was happening until people were dying. And so, let's don't get into that troubled political history,
Right.
but that's the Brits then were very much the same as many of us now about a more general catastrophes coming on the world. They would simply deny it was happening. It couldn't possibly be happening. This is a modern world. It couldn't possibly happen. Well, happened to them.
Right.
And so there are a good many Irish people in the United States are descended from people that fled that famine.
Right.
And so Malthus is, I think, his times and the context in which he spoke have been much misunderstood. And then, as a consequence of that great expansion, which had been going on really since beginning of European colonization, about 500 years.
Yep.
And then certainly the Industrial Revolution, and we could just mine things and produce things that generations before that couldn't have. And so there's the attitude about it that we tend to think this is normal, or even if we don't think it's particularly normal, we fall into the consumptive habits anyway. So one of the conversations we had, I think, had a Native American chief from Alaska on, Ilaron Merkeleyev, elder at large of the tribes of Alaska. And so he told the story of a fishing village on the Bering Sea, Kivalina. It's on a spit of land. The breakup of ice on the Bering Sea lets the waves pound it harder, and that spit of land is eroding, and they have to move. They've got to go somewhere else. If it had been 100 years ago, they would have put everything they owned in Umiax and paddled away. They've been living that way for maybe 10,000 years.
Yep.
But in the intervening 100 years or so, the village population increased. They have propane tanks, they have fuel oil tanks, they have generators, they have Wi-Fi, they have power boats, not Umiax. And yet, for food, they're highly dependent yet on their catch from the sea. And hardly anyone today feels a greater affinity with nature and more dependence on it than those people. But they got into the consumption trap, got themselves where they got all this stuff. They were trying to find somebody that could help them move it. Last I heard, they were planning out some big logistics exercise. They'd move their village about 20 miles up the coast, put things back together again, and tell all the government agencies and whatever, well, thank you for your concern. We have moved, and we've been doing this for a long time. We think we can do it again. And I don't know how it would change their philosophy of things, but I give that story because even the most environmentally concerned among us still fell into the trap of being bogged down by their own consumption and not being nearly as flexible as they once were.
Right. Right. So what's the average person to do? People are listening to this and saying, okay, yeah, I'm challenged by this to examine what I do, but what are some of the things that you recommend that individuals, when we realize that system change requires system change, but we also interact with that system, we're part of it. So what do we do? What's our responsibility in this as individuals?
I wish I had a great answer. You're quite right that we are part of the big system. I call it Big Other. Not Big Brother, just Big Other. We're constantly bombarded by messages to buy. Sometimes we're tracked, we're deceived. Your wife likes to watch TV programs that must be skewed to senior citizenship because half at least of all the commercials are for some kind of pharmaceutical. Ask your doctor about. Have you heard those things?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sort of the subtext message is, well, if you're not sick, you ought to be, so we can sell something to you. And so, uh, what did we do before we had all those things? And that sort of typifies the whole thing. You can probably break from that living in the excesses, living in the society we're in. But today, one of the great imbalances in the country, it's line speed with the internet.
Yep.
Fast in some places, and some places in rural America they don't have any at all yet. And how bad is this? You know, something that's a luxury for one generation becomes a necessity for the next. And that's how it goes. Because of things like this, the people that I know that are taking pretty effective action create kind of their little own community to isolate themselves a little more from the blandishments of big other. And so they will form a local community, sometimes called an intentional community.
Right.
Some people will love that. A lot of people can't stand it. I know I left small town life. I was part of the rural to urban migration some 60, 65 years ago. Many people were. They left Iowa. They went somewhere else. They left rural Indiana and rural Iowa emptied out. And so they went elsewhere to seek their fortune or just a job. And maybe they should think about coming back and doing something that's different. That is a different culture. I'd have to confess that, small town life always seemed kind of smothering to me. I want to go someplace where it's happening, man. Not Sleepyville.
Well, you know, the interesting thing that you bring that up, Doc, so Fairfield is a really fascinating laboratory for combining things like high-speed internet, which, yes, prior generations didn't have that. But there are certain technologies like that that are potent, as you well know, and we've talked about it, are potently enabling of this relocalization. Because if right here in Fairfield, we have Cambridge Investments, it's I think the 7th largest brokerage clearinghouse in the country, 800 employees. Go out Pleasant Plain Road, a little north of here, and look left and, excuse me, for a moment, you don't know whether you're in Westchester, New York, or you're in Fairfield.
Oh, well.
You know, you better know you're in Fairfield because there's a bean field to the left, a bean field to the right, and a cornfield behind it. But the building.
Fairfield, how many people?
10,400.
That's about the same size as the town where I am.
Right.
Our biggest employer is the state prison.
Well, so it's not just Cambridge Investments. It's so what this has. There were, and I think in terms of looking at what are some of the solutions, I think we can look to what has happened here. It may be somewhat unique. The Transcendental Meditation Organization bottled Parsons College when it had lost its accreditation. A bunch of people from around the country, in fact, around the world, moved in. They kind of wanted to be part of a community that was forming, so people came here. And interesting, in the beginning, this was a town that had a rich history, rich dynamic history. We had the largest Chautauqua outside of Chautauqua, New York, right in Fairfield.
That's interesting.
And Loudon manufacturing actually created a lot of the mechanical, but labor-saving devices that in the 19th century made farming much more tolerable, much more tolerable. So we have this rich history, but when the university, came in, manufacturing jobs were pretty static. The town had a university moldering away on Highway 1, and things weren't hugely dynamic. There's always a dynamic center, but from the outside. So painfully, slowly, a lot of young people moved in. They didn't know what to do, but they wanted to be here, but they didn't have jobs. So the entrepreneurial experiment here was pretty wild and woolly. But somehow, because people wanted to be here and one enterprise failed, then tried it again, and they tried again. And some very astute, very savvy people moved in who did know how to do that. So they taught others. Well, now we have a town that is totally bucking the trends of rural Iowa. We were one of the few communities outside the metropolitan area to actually grow. We grew at about by 10,000. Now, some of those might have been transplants from another state who came here temporarily, to gain benefits, but not all of them, not by a stretch. And so the town was built on principles of Richard Florida's work, creating the creative class. And so arts flourish, music, visual arts, dance, and people just simply deciding that rather than alluring an industry in, where you give all the tax benefits away, and then when the tax benefits run out, they take it somewhere else and kind of fleece another area. We built almost all of certainly the new entrepreneurial economy from scratch. And when we looked at the job growth, a good bit of the job growth, in fact, most of the job growth is in the new entrepreneurial economy. We have 2 solar companies in Fairfield that account for, I believe, more than 50% of all the solar installed in Iowa for the last 5 years or so. So not to belabor the point, we're getting pretty close to the top of the hour. I think there are models, and here's my personal take on it. I was am a fan of Father Bob Spitzer, president of Gonzaga College, who's a philosopher and a theologian and mathematician, pretty interesting fellow. And he talks about human life in relationship to Plato's 4 levels of happiness.
Mm-hmm.
First level of happiness is sense pleasure. Linguini, cuddling, whatever. The second level of happiness is differentiation. Better than, competition, all that. Third level of happiness is the happiness of altruism, the happiness of giving. And the fourth level of happiness is spiritual happiness. And he makes the point, Plato made the point that the derangements of the first level of happiness, eating too much linguine, will go do something. Go achieve, go differentiate. This also represents, the human development. When you hit puberty and you start growing, you need to differentiate from your parents, right? Some of us did it in rather spectacular ways. But, we have to become our own person. And we have to test ourselves in the world, go do something. But if we get stuck in that, then we mistake the pleasure of doing and differentiation and better than that with real happiness. And there isn't, because you're always better than, worse than, or the same. As he pointed out, in their own way, they're all hell. Whether you're better than, worse than, or the same. So then you move to the third level of happiness, happiness of altruism. And he said, now, interestingly, the intensity of each of these levels of happiness decreases, but the longevity or the durability of that happiness is more. So eating linguine, cuddling, whatever, it's like very, very immediate, very intense, but it doesn't last very long. second level of happiness. Well, I'm a guitarist. And so I'm thinking about out of police and I practice and practice. And you'd think I'd be happy when I got there, right? Oh, when I play it, it makes me happy. But what do I want to do? I want to go on to the next and the next and the next. It's an infinite regress. And that's, I think, Doc, this is my musings on it. It's from being stuck in that level 1 and level 2 that creates the illusion that we have to constantly grow. We can't be happy unless we're adding.
I like that explanation of it. I'd like to bring up one other thing about Fairfield from your story. I didn't know all that about Fairfield, but this is improving the community by your own effort, by your own creativity. What I see happening here about the same size town, want to attract outside investment and subsidize it to come. And I saw that with my wife when we were kids. My son gave me a history of it a year ago, written by a local historian, and the title tells you all you need to know. Until the coal train hauled it away. Because it was based on a fleeting exploitation of resources that disappeared when they were mined out. It was gone.
Yep.
You go to place after place and you see that. Puerto Rico today is an outstanding example of having that approach to development for the last 50, 60 years. And what's left in Puerto Rico? Not much. The people have, in general, a better standard of living, but they were never charged with improvement based on their own creativity and their own initiative. And then I've seen several studies of older people, 55, 60 and older, on life satisfaction. In almost every case, life satisfaction was not from something they had. It was something they had done. They were a great machinist at, or
whatever it was. They were a great shoe shine artist.
Yeah, whatever it was, they were proud of something they had done. And the money and the possessions made no difference.
Because John Eichert, again, legendary economist who moved to Fairfield because of who we were. He moved from Columbia to Fairfield. And the reality is that he points out that all the studies show that past a certain amount of purchasing power, it's not very great, like 50,000, 70,000, something like that. Past that purchasing power, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that greater purchasing power creates any more happiness.
Oh, yeah.
At a certain level, lack of money certainly creates unhappiness, right?
Oh, yeah. But
the other side, it's not. It doesn't go both ways. You can't infinitely increase happiness by material means. In fact, you can only go to a certain point where then your needs, your fundamental needs, are met. That's where we, I think, in Plato's 4 levels of happiness, the 4th one is, by the way, is spiritual happiness. He said that's the only one that can't be deranged. He said you handle the derangements of level 1 by going to level 2. You handle the derangements of level 2 by going level 3, but even that can be arranged. What do you mean you're not going to accept my gift? I'm the Messiah, or whatever. Any level of activity that isn't purely spiritual, that isn't silent inside, can be deranged. And so he said all of the other 3 are balanced by virtue of attending to that 4th, attending. And I think that's, many people in many ways, intuit that, feel that unless we are connected deep inside to who we really are, to our structure, to our being. Certainly the Vedic literature and much of the wisdom of the East is all around the idea of plumbing the depths of who we are.
Yes.
And allows all of the other aspects of life to come into balance. Otherwise, if you try to balance it within, then it's like trying to be stable in the middle of a choppy ocean. There isn't any real way to do that.
Yeah, particularly Buddhism, but the Oriental religions, some of them I'm not sure you can call them religions. They're more philosophy than religion. But they stress going very deep, balance, yin yang, and recognizing that you are not the center of your own universe.
At least not your body.
Yeah.
What we call ourselves, which is just 98 cents of chemicals or whatever, and a bunch of flesh. It is really interesting that. But my mom had a master's in religious counseling from Chicago Theological Seminary, University of Chicago, family systems, and so I grew up, steeped in, I think, a very accurate, that's my bias, a very accurate understanding of kind of the depth of Christian philosophy, if you will, if you want to do that. And again, I count her asking me to memorize the Sermon on the Mount as one of the great things in my life. Because when you look at the Beatitudes,
mm-hmm.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not a one of them says, blessed are the people who accumulate vast wealth, because they will be happy.
Yes, and
not a single one of them has anything to do with that.
Oh, yes. So it's give us this day our daily bread. It's not give me my Lamborghini.
Exactly. Because specifically, the Lamborghini per se doesn't make you happy. 5 houses per se don't make you happy. It's not, happiness isn't located in this world of forms and phenomena, independent of our own connection with our being. But the interesting thing is that if you get people who are more connected to their being, and people ask me, what's the secret in the sauce to Fairfield? I said, a lot of people have been practicing TM for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And it does root a person in the quietness of their interior.
Absolutely.
Structure. And because of that, they're just a little bit less rough. There's a few little less snags. There's more of a tendency to connect with things that are really truly create happiness rather than the illusion of happiness. Now, you can find plenty of examples of people in the community who have all kinds of values, all kinds of stuff. But on the average, a little bit of a shift. I say if they say we're using 1 or 2% of our mental potential, and let's be generous and say we're using 2%. But if we start using 3%, in absolute terms, that isn't very much, right? Much of a change. But if you look at the baseline, you're up 50%. And
absolutely. And you don't use all your mental potential ever unless you're really in a crisis.
Maybe that moment. But I think the point of all this, and the reason why I love the way you have laid out the issues, is from an eminent career of, I read your bio. No one could doubt, your capacity to function in the world and your contribution on many, many levels. And yet a person who is so steeped in the world of manufacturing and production and finance and all that would come to this potent conclusion. And I think maybe we'll come back and we'll talk more deeply in another segment about compression theory. But my understanding is that, you can expand your life by expanding your production, or the expansion can be sent in the opposite direction. Like the old calculus problems, you know, you never get to the limit, but you can get arbitrarily close to it. I feel like I'm preaching Catholicism to the Pope here. But, you know, the whole idea that by compression, by compressing the amount of materials that we need to live, and my feeling, Doc, is that the major compression is not in material science or all that. Major compression is right up here.
Well, I'd agree with that. The whole thing comes down to your attitude, your beliefs, your willingness to be happy with what you have. And of course, everybody wants something now and then maybe they don't have. But you don't have to want. And then after you have it, what do you do with it? I occasionally amuse the neighbors by taking the wastebasket out to the mailbox for a pre-sort. Because so much stuff just comes through, and if you kind of looked around the room, some of it's sitting here right now.
Right.
And so it's thrust upon us whether we want it or not. And it's maybe you can compare it to sort of mentally going into kind of a monastic mode, that I don't want all the stuff. I just want to be who I am and to be satisfied with that. And of course, you're going to be, when you do that, you're going to be accused of having no ambition, blah, blah, blah. You know, you get the.
Well, sure. And I think maybe on this last note, we can finish up and continue the conversation later. My personal view is that human beings can infinitely expand. They just can't infinitely expand with things. That's and I can show my prop. Here's one place where I can infinitely expand.
Sure.
Simple little machine. It has 6 strings. This is an entire orchestra. And I have a world of literature that I now own more sheet music than I could probably master in 2 lifetimes. But the expansion of my life is in terms of expansion of my capacity there. The expansion of capacity to connect with people in the community, to give, to be part of a community. There's where the infinite expansion can happen.
That's one explanation of what I mean by quality over quantity.
There you go.
Expand quality and not quantity.
Nakal, thank you very much. I see that we've kind of blown past our hour, but this has been a fantastic conversation, and we will come back. And next time you come back, let's dig deeply into compression theory. Looking from a manufacturing standpoint, what do we actually do? How do we do that? Because there's some profound implications for our industry and the way we make things and do things. So folks, we'll close up. I will jump off of Facebook, and thank you very, very much for being with us, and we'll see you next week.